I don't want to talk for long at all. In fact, it'll probably be about 10 minutes in total. And I will keep an eye on the time. Um, and I think the first thing I just want to say, and I'm not saying this on behalf of anybody other than myself, is to thank everybody who has contributed to this symposium, all the presentations, and I can't run through them or summarize them, obviously, in the time that I have available to me, have made me think, have taught me things that I hadn't realized before, have done what, in fact, these symposia always do, and that is to destabilize me, to make things change. I mean, in productive ways rather than in destructive ways. And one way in which I thought I might try and sort of respond, and it's purely a personal response again, I mean, I think people will carry away very different things from what's been said, is by way of returning to the word which we started with, decolonization, and to just think about it in the context of an idea of the great, in my view, the great Russian critic Bakhtin, when he identified what he called speech genres. So I just want to think about decolonization in relationship to speech genres. I don't want to go into some elaborate account of what a speech genre is, because that would again take too long, but I think you'll get a flavor, if you don't know Bakhtin's work, of what a speech genre is as I talk. And really what I'm talking about as much as anything is how I've encountered the word, the context in which I've encountered the word. And the first way in which I've encountered that word would be in the speech genre of the call to action, a kind of revolutionary call to change. There's a very brilliant analysis by the British philosopher Howard Kegel of this genre of the call to action in his book on resistance, if you want to find out more about it. But I associate it, that is to say, the call to decolonize the curriculum, for instance, with similar calls for action that have emanated from Black Lives Matter and from Me Too. They seem to me to be a part of a very important process which we're undergoing. And one of the key features of that process is that more and more people, for a range of different reasons, are saying they're no longer prepared to put up with what they've been putting up with. And that this unwillingness to, or this assertion rather than unwillingness, assertion of the fact that they're no longer willing to put up with what they've had to put up with, is translating into a call for change, and for change to happen not in the far future, but now. Now, I think that provokes all sorts of turbulences within the culture, within cultures, within different cultures. But it seems to me that it's one of the ways in which we can locate this call to decolonize, or decolonize the curriculum, as it's sometimes said. Now, there are a number of things, though, to add to that, because I think it takes us back to what I want to say is a cautionary note in Amit's position statement, and which has been echoed in some of the things that have been said. Obviously, when you think about where that call is located, well, it's located primarily in universities. It's from universities that the call to decolonize has come. And in its recent manifestation anyway, I mean, one of the very valuable things, of course, of the symposium has been to actually, of course, uncover the hidden histories of decolonization, the hidden histories of efforts to decolonize. And it initially was, of course, something that came from students, sometimes supported by faculty, sometimes not supported by faculty. But it was a student-led initiative, at least in my first readings about it, and indeed in my first encounters with it. And it arose out of an impatience with the kinds of writers that were required to be read. I think of the episode in Yale when students protested against the fact that they were required to study 17th century English poetry. It wasn't an optional part of the curriculum, it was a compulsory part of the curriculum. And similar objections were raised to the kinds of books that were being made prominent, the kinds of books that were being promoted as valuable. So it was a book-centered, canonical-centered sort of issue. What was startling to me about it was the rapidity with which it was picked up in the language of management and became a part of the way in which university administrators in particular, and that rather specious category of academic leader, would start to elaborate, and this is what I think Amit has in mind when he uses the word policy, of decolonization as policy, would now become a new way in which academics working largely in the humanities were required to acknowledge the importance of decolonization and change their habits accordingly. So it's an interesting feature of decolonization, I think, in the way in which it's been absorbed in universities, is that it has, amongst other things, and I don't for a moment by saying this want to dismiss it, to say that it has become part of the vocabulary of university management. But that doesn't, for a moment, I think, take away from the important militancy that lies in the call to decolonize. And I don't want us to lose that militancy or to lose the militant spirit that I think is at work there. The second speech genre, which I want to just locate it in, and this will be the last one that I'll locate it in, is the speech genre that I would call critique. And here I want to raise what for me is a question that's circling in my mind as a result of listening to what I've heard over these 2 days. I don't have an answer to this question, but I do see different directions for decolonization, at least within the context of the university, as to how we respond to this question. And it's been illuminated in a number of the talks that have been given. Is the nexus of the movement to decolonize still contained within the paradigm of a Foucauldian preoccupation with the relationship between power and knowledge, with the corresponding focus upon an idea of representation as the nexus within which the relationship between those two things is to be discerned? And one of the things that I've taken away from what's been said is some very, and I think of what Amit had to say about the way of wanting to get away from that particular nexus, wanting to get away from that particular way of thinking about the relationships between different kinds of writing, between different kinds of attention, when he advocated a notion of noticing what had been perhaps ignored or overlooked, rather than a preoccupation with what I would call the Foucauldian knowledge power critique of representation. So it seems to me that I'm familiar with a form of decolonization which still seems to me very bound up with that Foucauldian problematic, and which sees the question of representation as a crucial element within the critique that decolonization gives rise to. But what's been rewarding about this conference is the way in which an alternative idea or a set of alternative ideas have emerged. And let me just briefly state what some of those are before I want to end with a couple of questions and a couple of thoughts. From the very fascinating discussion about science, I take two things. One is the need to accept what scientists say when they talk about objectivity, and not simply to distance that in terms of another, as it were, turn in the knowledge power matrix. There's been a great deal of difficulty in my experience in the humanities to actually accept that feature of science. And I think it's been damaging to the humanities that that's been so. It's a complex feature of science, but it's nonetheless one that needs to be thought through as we begin to extend one of the most important elements that have emerged out of this, as we begin to extend and complicate our understanding of what the human is, of what is at stake in this question of being a part of the human species. And another thing that I take both from the discussion of science that we had earlier, and indeed from the other presentations, is the thought that we need, and I think we need to do this quite urgently, we do need to change our histories. Certainly our histories of discovery, and clearly our histories of literature and of culture. And what I find most interesting at the moment is the question of where and when and whether this is happening. I can see that there's a very clear case being made for what it might be like, but when is it going to take root is a question that still remains open to me, because of the way in which there's a certain sense of the university space as a space of closure rather than of openness, of labeling rather than of exploration. So those thoughts go along with this idea of thinking about processes, of thinking about flows, of thinking about the magazine as much as the book, of thinking about what might seem to be small and peripheral forms, but in fact finding in those small and peripheral forms what is often quite vital versions of what it means to think about a world literature. And of course, that's the important thing in thinking about world literature, is that there are many worlds, not just one world literature. And the interesting thing too that has gone through about what is being forgotten or ignored or overlooked. Amir's talk on Han Suen is particularly powerful in that respect, about the way in which when we're thinking about decolonization, we're not simply thinking about the future, we're also thinking about what has been lost in the recent past as well as in the far past. There's another element. I'm now not thinking about the role of decolonization as a concept in critique, or rather, I'm thinking about the very interesting fact, and this has emerged in the talks that have been given, that we are beginning to think about colonization not only as a matter of the history of the relationships between one country and another, of the colonizing power and the colonized, but we're beginning to think about it as a form of human relationship and of an attempt to go beyond the colonial relationship as the typical relationship between human beings. And one of the striking things that, of course, emerges from that thought, and it's been around in the symposium, is the question of what are the new forms of colonial relationship? What are the emerging forms of colonialism as distinct from the older and historical forms of colonialism? And there's one thing I'd like to add here, which I don't think has quite been said, but it takes us back into the bubble, or the bubbles, that Amit was talking about in his presentation. Because of course, universities have played a very significant role in the creation and maintenance of those bubbles, and have themselves this very troubled relationship with the idea of the world, because there are so many world-class universities in existence now, that you begin to wonder whether there is any university that isn't world-class. But if you wanted to think about where the new colonialisms are emerging, that's exactly where they're emerging, because one of the most significant gulfs and divisions that now exist, and not simply in India, but equally in the United States and the United Kingdom, is of course the division between those who are highly educated and those who are not. And this division is now being experienced as a relationship between those who are in a position of mastery and those who are in a position of subordination. Now, what has been, I think what is very interesting about the particular time we find ourselves in, is that the legitimating ideology of that division, which is meritocracy, has itself now been put into question very eloquently by the Harvard philosopher Michael Sandel in his book called The Tyranny of Merit. But if you wanted to find one of the places where the colonial relationship is being actively produced, it would seem to me it would be in that division. And so there's always this interesting question as people talk about decolonization as an infinite and endless process, about where we are as academics and in other respects within that whole trend, within that whole idea of, is it possible to move beyond the colonial relationship? The other thing I think that strikes me, it came through in what Amir was saying. There's it's this notion of conviviality. If we think beyond the colonial relationship, there's a very interesting sense that I get from reading certain kinds of work of critique and of imaginative fiction, which are all pushing towards some sense of what it means to live convivially. I don't mean by that necessarily to live pleasurably, but to live in a way which is accepts the notion of the convivial as a living together with, rather than a seeking of mastery or supremacy over. And this is part of a much, I think, broader trend, which has to do and is connected to the kind of issues that Michael Sandel is raising, which is about a critique of the idea that our primary relations are relations of competition and of success and of outbidding one with another. Just want to close with something I'm reading at the moment. It's a book by an activist. His name is Nick Hayes, and it's called The Book of Trespass. And this has to do with what I was saying earlier about the way in which one is in a time of reimagining what the colonial relationship is. This book is about the history of property in the United Kingdom, and it's about the processes of enclosure, which enclosed a great deal of common land. It reminds us of the fact that the aristocracy in England own a great deal of land. And what is interesting to me about it is that it begins to describe a colonial relationship within England itself. And one of the features of that colonial relationship is precisely, he charts this very well in terms of his own sentiments, his own feelings and responses, his terrible fear about what will happen to him if he trespasses on the land of aristocrats. He realizes that his own education, his own formation has brought him into a sense of their superiority in relationship to his own inferiority, that indeed the processes of colonization in that sense were underway in England long before, if you like, they were taken out into the countries that became the British Empire. There was that colonial impetus already in place in relationship between the rulers of England and those over whom they ruled. And it persists, Hayes very persuasively argues, it persists psychologically in us still. It's not gone away. It's not been overcome. So with that thought about the way in which decolonization no longer simply describes a relationship between two geographies or two countries or two places or two cultures or a multiplicity of cultures, but is now also being thought about as a form of human relationship which we need to move beyond. I want to just conclude these remarks, but before I do, just two different words of thanks. Thank you very much to Ashoka for hosting this, but as always, and above all, thank you to Amit for the inspiration which led to its happening in the first place, and the very thoughtful remarks he himself has made about decolonization during the course of this symposium. So thanks all very much. Thank you.